theatrical by this incredible photograph by Evan Vucci, easily the photo of the year and surely set to be one of the decade. Given that Trump didn't die, however, and wasn't even particularly injured, this assassination attempt obviously won't be anywhere as important as the JFK shooting or anything. But this is still one of those big, flashy, photogenic events that people will always remember, even if just as a spectacle to parody. In other Trump-related news, his return to the White House also introduced a new name to the list of American politicians that everyone is expected to know: Vice President J.D. Vance. Vance is Trump's second vice president, something that became necessary after he turned so fanatically against the previous one, who had refused to assist in his conspiracy to stay in power after losing the 2020 election. So, J.D. Vance first burst onto the scene in 2016 after writing a best-selling memoir about his disturbing upbringing in rural Ohio. In those days, Vance was considered a pretty middle-of-the-road, conventional type of conservative, whose big argument was that a lot of the poor, white working class were basically architects of much of their own misfortune. He was deeply skeptical of Trump, who he called a peddler of cultural heroin that distracted lower-class voters from their personal responsibilities. In the years following Trump's first election, however, Vance made a pretty sharp turn and became an increasingly devoted Trump supporter, eventually getting elected to the Senate as a MAGA Republican. In this role, he became well known for serving as an intermediary between the world of formal politics and the internet's growing subculture of far-right intellectuals, activists, and social media personalities.
There's this guy Curtis Yarvin who's written about some of these things.
Since Trump is now in the unusual position of starting a new term that will also be his last, we can expect that jockeying to be the next Republican presidential candidate will be one of the big themes of the next 4 years, with Vance one of the main characters in this succession drama. But that said, vice presidents have a tendency to quickly fade into the background, and Vance has never been terribly well-liked. A guy who might wind up looming larger in the world of the second Trump term would be my next addition to the cultural canon, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So, the Kennedys are obviously the most famous political family in American history, and it's quite remarkable that they've been able to maintain their cultural relevance for as long as they have. Every generation, in fact, seems to adopt a new Kennedy to serve as figurehead of the times. Joseph Kennedy as an America First isolationist in the lead up to World War II. John F. Kennedy as a symbol of mid-century optimism. Robert Kennedy as a leader of young activists in the 60s. And then Ted Kennedy serving several decades in the Senate as the lion of mainstream American liberalism. And now, after a brief interregnum, we have Robert Kennedy Jr. as a guy who has proven to be very exciting to a new coalition of anti-establishment populists and conspiracy theorists that have become the backbone of Trump's MAGA movement. RFK Jr. had started to make a name for himself in recent years as a figure within America's alternative health and wellness subculture that rejects a great deal of quote-unquote mainstream medicine and medical advice, most notably vaccines. Being a vaccine skeptic used to be a somewhat pan-ideological identity, with factions on both the more hippie-ish naturopathic left as well as the evangelical Christian right. But the COVID vaccines and the mandates around them proved to be a real deal breaker for the progressive faction and caused many of them, like RFK, to defect to Trump, which was of course fairly ironic because Trump's administration was responsible for the COVID vaccines in the first place, but that has never really bothered anyone for some reason. RFK Jr. ran for president as a Democrat against Joe Biden before dropping out to run briefly as an independent, and then dropping out a second time to endorse Donald Trump, who in turn, at the time of this filming, has stated an intent to make him the head of the US Health Department. Kennedy remains very popular with the general public, certainly more popular than Trump himself, meaning that there is good reason to suspect that his endorsement might have played a not insignificant role in helping Trump get elected. And that speaks to the growing clout of the more conspiratorial faction of MAGA, embodied by a growing array of populist characters, including Tulsi Gabbard, Joe Rogan, and Alex Jones, who didn't think of identifying as Republicans until Trump came along. But it is RFK who, by virtue of being a Kennedy, feels like the one who is least likely to be forgotten. Okay, so that was a lot of politics, but like I said, it was a very political year. But in any case, let us now move on to some less political things. So I think by now it is clear that the 2020s are going to be defined as the start of the AI era. What is less clear, however, is whether this is going to be an era of long and lasting cultural significance, like the television era or the internet era, or something more brief, faddish, and ultimately underwhelming, like, say, the Laserdisc era. What is clear, however, is that when we say AI these days, we mean a technology able to produce writing or pictures, so-called generative AI, which is a bit different than how we've previously thought of AI, which was as more of a robot thing. Nevertheless, generative AI has now been integrated into an enormous amount of websites and apps that give users the ability to casually generate things like form letters, emails, clip art, and all sorts of other stuff. And this tech has now become so mainstream that I feel like 2024 marked the moment where the culture established a definitive symbol for what we need to press or click whenever we want to auto-generate content of this sort. And the symbol is this thing. I feel like this sparkle was suddenly everywhere in 2024, from ads on billboards to illustrations in the Atlantic. It's been a while since a new form of technology has gone so mainstream that we've all had to learn a new symbol to represent it. Wi-Fi arcs might be the last great one. Or maybe this cigarette with the lightning bolt coming out of it that you see on no vaping signs. Speaking of symbols, another one that really entered the mainstream this year was this version of the LGBT+ pride flag. So I talked a bit about the history of the pride flag in a previous award-winning video, and how it went from this to briefly this to this, with this version being created by Daniel Quasar in 2018. The motivation for these changes was, of course, to make the pride flag more inclusive by incorporating new colored lines representing trans people and people of color. But apparently this was not quite inclusive enough. So in 2021, a British equality rights activist named Valentino Vecchetti created this version with a yellow triangle with a purple circle in it. Valentino is intersex, and this new symbol is based on the intersex pride flag, which was created by an Australian intersex activist in 2013. Intersex describes the rather small community of people whose biological sex is rendered indeterminate in some way, usually relating to the nature of their sexual organs. People used to use the term hermaphrodite, but that's a pretty offensive word now. Anyway, I feel like 2024 saw this version of the pride flag achieve mainstream status in terms of being the flag increasingly the most likely to be displayed as a symbol of tolerance for sexual and gender diversity in shops and schools and government buildings and things, as well as at official LGBT+ celebrations. The new flag hasn't been without controversy, of course. It is popular to say that the pride flag is suffering from a bit of identity politics creep, in the sense of getting more and more complicated as new groups insist on explicit recognition. There's also a sense that intersex people, who probably number around 1% of the population, just aren't a big enough group to deserve nearly 12% of the pride flag's real estate. But when it comes to these sorts of things, most people do err on the side of inclusivity, so for now, this seems like the symbol of tolerance we're going to be seeing for a while. Although you would be justified to suspect that this might not be the final form. My next inclusion is maybe a little bit controversial. It is the concept of tech oligarchs. Now, obviously, the tech sector has been a big part of the American economy for quite a while now, and certainly wealthy tech CEOs like Bill Gates have been characters in American life for close to 3 decades. But oligarch is a different term. It refers to the idea of people who combine wealth with political power, which is something that tech people have historically not been that interested in until now. I feel like 2024 was a moment in which it became pretty undeniable that a new generation of tech company CEOs who had acquired their wealth from building internet platforms and increasingly crypto and AI as well were interested in politics in a way that the tech billionaires of the personal computer era were not. People like David Sacks, Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, and of course Elon Musk are all unapologetically political and politically outspoken, stating bluntly what they believe the American political system should and shouldn't do, and not being shy about throwing around their money to achieve it. People sometimes use terms like tech bro or oligarch to describe them, in part because a lot of them have political views that are kind of reactionary and chauvinistic in a stereotypically macho